I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is about acceptance.
It is?
Accepting our
We didn't talk
fate.
about this beforehand. I didn't know that that was a thing.
It is.
That was going to... Yeah?
It is. We're looking at the Huainanzi.
Oh, yes.
And
I say that as though I'm surprised.
You've
even though we both
accepted
agreed.
that we are going to look at this.
I have accepted that we're going to look at it. And the part of the Huainanzi we're going to look at is about acceptance as well.
That's correct. So can you give us a little background on the Huainanzi?
So the Huainanzi is one of those works that's sort of... It's kind of hard for people to agree on whether it's a great classic or kind of a blow-off. So the
It's
great...
sort of both.
It's kind of both. So the great scholar Wing-Sit Chen, who has, I think, one of the essential works of translation into English of Chinese works, it's called the Chinese source book in Chinese philosophy. He accords the Huainanzi about 5 pages. He's like, yeah, basically this is like all the other stuff. It's like the greatest hits of classical studies is about how he puts it.
And we should point out a lot of kind of traditional Chinese sayings are drawn from the Huainanzi. Mm-hmm. It has a lot of source material.
The Huainanzi is a 2nd century BC text attributed to a noble named Liu An, who was the king of Huai, the king of the kingdom of Huai. And the text is essentially a collection of, not sayings, but he cobbled together a lot of the great scholars in the area, brought them to his kingdom, had them sit down and debate various topics and questions that were of issue and of interest to him, and then compiled this text based on what came out of those discussions.
So that's the story. How much do we believe that?
It's one of those origin stories. Who knows, really? But it's a decent enough origin story, and it explains a good bit because it does feel very much like an edited volume, but with an editor who has a heavy hand in the proceedings. So this doesn't read like a neatly structured single text. Like even something like the Zhuangzi has a kind of a through line. You know, right. you can see Zhuangzi, the philosopher, in all of it, no matter how it was written. There are certain considerations and points of view that you see come up again and again and again.
More so in the inner chapters than the outer chapters for Zhuangzi, but still, yeah. you make a point.
You know what I mean? And one of the reasons that this text, people sort of go, about this one, is that it tries to bring together a lot of very disparate elements in classical Chinese studies, like the Dao De Jing, the Zhuangzi, like Tao, what's called Taoism, what is sometimes called Confucianism, legalism, stuff that really doesn't necessarily work together. They're trying to make work together. Mm-hmm. And the principal question really behind the work is, how do you use Taoism, which is, you know, Lee, you and I have talked about this, not really the most practical ideology for governing anything. How do you make that usable by a king or a governor, which is sort of the idea behind the text? How do you use this to sort of inform government? And, you know, when we were talking about Lao Tzu, talking about the Dao De Jing, we talked specifically about the concept of inaction or...
So hang on, we're talking about Wu Wei now.
Yeah, we're talking about Wu Wei. I'm using the English translation.
Inaction or not the doing of not doing things or something like that.
Yeah, the idea being that you seek to understand the way things work so well that you don't have to make them work. They're already working. You just figure out how to go along with them. That's the sort of the ideal. Well, that's not really the best thing to think about if you're going to govern a kingdom. How do you not do stuff so well that everything gets done, you know?
Although Daoist in the Huainanzi and elsewhere do propose a series of kind of governing principles that at least they would argue, and I think we have to kind of give them credit, would be a great way to rule the country.
It is interesting, but one of the things that's challenging with this work is that in some of the more, I think we could call them orthodox Daoist passages, the idea is basically, well, it's impossible to know 100% now. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. That's not really, you can't really do that with a lot of decisions.
Rob's not satisfied with Wu Wei. He's not.
Well, you know what's funny?
He's not a Wu Wei ruler.
I'm not a ruler, period. And this is one of the reasons I'm not a ruler.
You rule your classroom.
I don't rule I kind of rule my classroom. That makes it sound like I walk in and just like I'm an old schoolmaster with a ruler in his hand, like
no, that's
smacking
what I do.
knuckles. Yeah, that's what I do. But I find it interesting.
Kids love discipline.
They do. We're not going to go there, though. We're, of course, being somewhat sarcastic. But
he says pulling the old ball and chain out of his S&M bags.
Clankety clank. Well, we joke about what I think of Taoism or Wu Wei, but I find it a fascinating concept for a lot of reasons, partly because, we have sayings in English like hindsight is 20/20. The idea being that you don't really know what's going on now. You can really only know in retrospect. And I find that immensely compelling. And the passage we're looking at from the Huainanzi today is the most famous part, or at least the most quoted part of the Huainanzi.
Yeah, probably one of them.
It's the one that makes the most sense and is the most thought-provoking in terms of how would you decide something for a country?
So we're starting to get into this particular passage. Rob, would you mind? I was going to ask you to summarize it, but it's so short that actually it might just be better for you to translate it.
Among the people who lived close to the border, this being the border of what was then sort of civilized, quote-unquote, China.
So we're talking about the border of Mongolia and China.
There was a man who led a righteous life. Without reason, his horse escaped and fled into barbarian territory. Everyone felt sorry for him, but the old man said, "What makes you think this is not good?" Several months later, the horse returned, and it was accompanied by a huge barbarian stallion. Everyone was happy for him, but the old man said, "What makes you think that it's not possible this is bad?" The family was richer because of a second good horse, and the son enjoyed riding it. But he fell, and he broke his hip, and everyone felt sorry for him, but the old man said, "What makes you think that this could not end up being a good thing?" 1 year later, a large party of barbarians entered the border, or crossed the border. All the eligible men took their bows and arrows and went to battle. But from the people who are living around the border, 9 out of 10 died. But just because he was lame, the old man and his son were both spared. So, good fortune turns into bad fortune, and bad fortune turns into good fortune. These changes never reach an end, and their complexity can never be understood. And that's the whole parable, the whole story. And you'll notice a couple of things.
Well, first we should point out that there is a famous phrase for those of y'all who are learning Chinese that comes out of this.塞翁失馬. So that just means the borderlands grandpa loses his horse. And it's a reference to essentially almost like you never know what will actually turn out to be good and what will turn out to be bad.
For me, it's a very compelling thought. And it's phrased in a very simple way, but it's a very compelling thought because a lot of times we attempt to explain why something is good now instead of simply saying in retrospect, we will see. Even I think in the 19th century, one of my favorite Chinese scholars, Wang Guowei, wrote a lot about Western philosophy, especially Immanuel Kant. And one of the things he said was, this whole logic and reason thing, that's great, but it's only ever possible to say that something is reasonable in retrospect. You can't say that someone is being reasonable. You just have to wait and see what happens because of their decisions. It's an argument you can pick a lot of holes in, of course. But it's an interesting one because it's part of this tradition. It's part of a tradition that says you can't know now. Like, now is not the time when you are able to say 100% if something is correct, good, or otherwise. But it's also kind of a tricky ideology if you're a king. Like, well, we'll just wait and see. Well, you can't wait and see. You have to decide now.
It's much easier to kind of live your life this way rather than rule your country this way, right?
Exactly. But, of course, this was sort of the, I don't know, impossible goal, I suppose, of the Huainanzi, is to try to make this usable, make this workable. And the fact that, of course, it was never really adopted as part of Chinese orthodoxy, sort of Confucian orthodoxy, might have something to do with why it was never incorporated. But
yeah, I mean, Taoism is interesting because it's existed for this whole period. I mean, people have been transmitting these texts. Think about that, kind of the institutional resources that are necessary to keep these texts going.
Yeah.
Like, you have to have someone pretty much copying this every generation over a period of more than 2,000 years. So, like, there is support for this in the community, but it's just a question of who supports it.
Well, and it's interesting because, no, Taoism is not really a state ideology. It's not the sort of thing you'd use to govern the state. But many of the great works of Taoism, like the Zhuangzi, like the Tao Te Ching, are among the most translated Chinese works in the world.
The Tao Te Ching specifically is one of the most translated works.
I think it's like first or second in English.
Yeah, into English.
Yeah.
Now, most of the people who translate it cannot speak Chinese.
So they're doing this
kind
sort of tandem
mumbo-jumbo,
translation thing, yeah.
But that said, it's still garnered a wide amount of interest, and it's a unique kind of ambassador for Chinese culture, which is fascinating because it's not like fully orthodox Chinese culture.
And it's interesting in a way because that's in some ways the best illustration possible of what Taoism is, because it doesn't have a champion. It doesn't have someone telling all other people you have to study this, because that would definitely be not Daoist, right? It's not demanding anything of anyone, but everyone is still reading it and studying it anyway. It's sort of natural. Now, among other things, this little story is interesting because it brings to bear some politics as well, right? Because this is set on the border, and the specific situation is someone dealing with barbarian tribes, the Mongols or whoever would be living across the border.
The text doesn't really explicitly
it
say.
doesn't. It's just
and this is
barbarians.
coming at a time when, well before, quote-unquote, Mongols existed.
But it's also getting at a political strain that goes all through Chinese literature, and that is sort of the fate of the ordinary people, the common people. And in this case, it's someone whose household is at least poor enough that the loss of a horse is catastrophic. One horse is catastrophic. And
That's a huge amount of capital investment at this time.
Yeah, it is, especially if you're not one of the nobles that has access to many, many horses, right? And so it's interesting that the Liu An, the compiler, editor, possibly writer of much of this, takes this as the example. When you look at other philosophers like Mencius, like Confucius, they tend to be in dialogue with the greats, those in power, because these are the people you want to influence so that they can influence the society beneath them.
So Mencius is always talking with King Liang or King whoever.
Right. And insisting that, listen, if you want your people to be moral, you've got to set things into place so that they have time to reflect and be moral people, right?
But this text is trying to engage the common people.
Huh. It's trying to engage the common people, and it's doing it in such a way that isn't that really far removed from Laozi or Zhuangzi, because both of those use very homely and sort of homespun examples as well.
And they both tend to set their stories in very far-flung places, like this story.
Right, it does.
I would say that's just an element of Taoism, a kind of rural orientation.
It's a rural orientation, yeah. And in this case, what's interesting, among other things, is the last sort of phrase/line talks about changes, that changes never end.
Turn and face the strange.
Okay, you can never do that again. Ever. I know. Somebody had to. If you didn't, one of the listeners was doing it in their head, so it's fine. But that's one of the things we talked about, the parable of the butterfly from Zhuangzi.
Yeah, so it seems like the end of that parable, right?
It does. It talks about changes as well. That these things, transformation is just a part of reality. Now, the advantage to that, if you're going to be governing a state, is to bear in mind the fact that whatever you decide now might turn out to be something different later. And it lends a kind of flexibility to decision-making that you might not have if you were staying rigidly adherent to sort of the 5 Confucian classics.
But on the other side, this allows for a flexibility that I would say the state oftentimes doesn't have. The nature of states is that they're institutional and oftentimes inflexible, and so there is this sense that I don't know if this really can be used.
Well, but the thing, what I would counter with, though, is that that's probably true in a country like, say, ours, where you have this massive bloated bureaucracy where, no, you have to make a decision now, right? But like with Mencius and Confucius and the others, when you're dealing with a single ruler, one king, right, specifically a king with the kind of clout to pull things off himself, not the kind of king whose eunuchs or court officials are actually controlling things and he's just out hunting, but the actual king who's pulling all the strings, you really only have to influence one person. If one person is flexible, then it's possible that other people will be flexible as well, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think you're right in the sense that something like this is fairly silly almost for, like, the President of the United States, for example.
Or even, looking at it, Qin Emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who, within a few years of this text being compiled, establishes a giant empire that is very much deterministic and determining in how it sets standards. It sets standards for axle size and coin size and things like that.
And specifically writing and reading and what you should write and read. But it's interesting here because, as well, this is using examples of people who you're not supposed to really emulate, right? You should emulate the king. You should emulate the Duke of Zhou, like Confucius admonishes people. A farmer on the border with only one horse? Why in the world would you even care what someone like that thinks, right? So there's an interesting political intervention here as well. I mentioned that earlier, but it's worth noting because there aren't a lot of texts like this. You and I have talked about this as well, that it's usually left to something like poetry or even music to talk about the common people. Du Fu has a lot of poetry, for example, about quote-unquote common people.
Tao Yuanming really sticks out.
Yeah, Tao Yuanming for certain,
and Tao Yuanming is drawing on that Daoist tradition the Huainanzi is coming out of.
And it's just fascinating to me about this kind of stuff because this is not the text that the state would ever teach people, right? This is not the sort of thing that was ever state orthodoxy because it's not anything that makes the state look great or makes those in power look good. This is something that says, listen, there are concepts and principles that apply no matter what station you're in. And that used to be the province of, say, entertainment. But this is attempting something very similar with a farmer who's losing a horse, a very common, ordinary tale that's being told to a ruler, which is fairly provocative.
As a final thought, Rob, we should tell the listener that we actually recorded this and you lost the podcast. and I was
maybe it was a good thing, Lee. Maybe it was a good thing.
At the time, I thought, is this a bad thing?
And it's turned out to be a good thing
because this is a much better podcast.
Actually, I don't even remember what we said before. So
no, it is
right.
Much better.
You remember, and it was really stupid, and this one was much better. I'm glad to know that because I felt bad about losing it. Now I don't. Maybe it was a great thing. So anyway, as a final thought of mine, the Huainanzi is not one of those texts that is canonical, but it's partly interesting because of that.
It's one of those things that people are always referring to.
It's an interesting syncretic experiment. And I say syncretic experiment because it's an attempt to bring together a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily go together. So in the interest of finding out how might you combine stuff like legalism and Taoism, this is an interesting thing to look at.
And I think that's a good place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.